turn back time if I could find a way. Share and share alike, as they say. So we're going to be doing our peek into the past. So it's a school in 1864. From America's earliest days to the time when Addie was growing up, it was very difficult for African Americans, especially enslaved African Americans, to get an education. Black children were not allowed to attend the earliest American schools at all, although some still learned to read and write. Sometimes they learned from whites who wanted them to read the Bible or do work that required reading and writing. Blacks who did learn how to read and write often taught others. By the mid-1700s, a few churches and some individuals also opened schools for black children. So you can see this is what the schools would look like. By the 1830s, it was against the law in most southern states to teach African Americans to read and write. Many whites didn't want blacks to be able to read about freedom in the North because they were afraid their slaves would run away. So essentially, knowledge is power. And they felt that if black people were able to read, they would become too smart and then might run away for freedom. So that's wildly messed up. They didn't want them to write either because then they would be able to write notes called passes that said they were free to leave the plantations. People who were caught teaching African Americans to read could be put in prison or forced to pay large fines. Black people who were caught learning to read and write might be whipped or punished in some other ways. Even though it was dangerous, many black children in the South secretly learned to read and write. Some children had their lessons at night after working hard all day. Others traded something for lessons. For example, one enslaved boy who was a good marble player helped a white boy learn to play marbles. The white boy then taught him about the alphabet. So here's what a pass would look like for a slave to get their freedom. And then there's a white woman reading the Bible to black children. Slave children might hide under an open window outside a school to listen and learn whatever they could. Some slave owners ignored the laws and taught their slaves to read and write anyway. Sometimes the slave owner's wife or children taught slaves without the owner knowing about it. Even in the North, where there was no slavery, schooling for black children was poor. Some cities began to have public schools for all children, but usually black children were taught in separate schools from white students, just as Addie said. This separation is called segregation, which we talked about. They said that things were separate but equal, but they definitely were not. Black people were given worse conditions. And some of this still persists today, even though it's not blatantly said. Some African American parents paid tutors to teach their children rather than send them to the crowded public schools for blacks. In Philadelphia and many other northern cities, some African Americans had their own small schools and homes or churches that were often better than the segregated public schools. So they would have their own school that was separate from the public one because they could provide better, if that makes sense. During Addie's time, the school year in Philadelphia began in the fall and ended in May or June. Schools taught reading, writing, spelling, grammar, geography, arithmetic, and sometimes American history. Students sometimes used an abacus to learn arithmetic. You were very lucky to have calculators. Some schools also taught music and drawing, as well as sewing and knitting for girls. Many schools began to place students in different grades, too. In all schools of the time, teachers emphasized patriotism, duty to God and parents, thrift, which means being able to save money, order, cleanliness, and obedience. During the war years, northern schools often started or ended the day with a patriotic song. America and Rally Round the Flag were very popular. Black parents in the North wanted black teachers to teach in their public schools, but there were very few African American teachers until after the Civil War. Philadelphia's Institute for Colored Youth was the country's first high school for African Americans. People like Miss Dunn were educated there. During the Civil War, many slaves ran away to freedom or were set free by Union troops. These newly freed slaves were called freedmen. Churches and other groups in the North began to send teachers, both black and white, to teach the freedmen. Schools were set up wherever space could be found, in houses, sheds, or stables, until regular schools could be built. At first, there were not enough supplies or desks. So here is a woman. Her name is Fannie M. Jackson, and she was a teacher. And these are what the schools look like, and you can see all the children lining up outside to go. African American adults and children flocked to these schools in the South, though they often faced anger and even threats to their lives from whites who wanted blacks to stay uneducated and enslaved. The schools were successful mostly because of the efforts of African Americans themselves. So black people fought for their own education. White people were not as helpful as history might make it seem. Okay. The schools They took risks, made sacrifices, and gave the schools whatever money or goods they could so they could get an education. By the time Addie was in school, thousands of blacks had learned to read and write. They knew that education meant true freedom. That education opened the door to better jobs and better lives. So, and then here's a child teaching their parents, which we saw Addie do in this book. And here's children outdoors studying because there wasn't always a school for them to go to. So that just gives you a little peek at what their school life was like. Very different than what we have today. And that ends our reading of Addy Learns lesson. I hope you enjoyed it. The next girl we'll be reading is my childhood favorite. So, see you soon.